Morning, everyone. Hey, it's good to see you. Glad you're here. Today, we're moving forward in this Greater Than series, studying the book of Mark, talking about Jesus, the things that Jesus did. And Mark writes in such a way, he's the shortest gospel, and Mark writes to invite us in. He says, hey, I want you to come see the things that Jesus did. And he doesn't use lots of big words and a whole bunch of things we don't understand. Mark says, hey, this is what Jesus did. I want you to know about it. I want you to be a part of it. And so we've been working through the things that Jesus is greater than as we see in the book of Mark. Today we're going to continue talking about that, what Jesus is greater than. I want to pray and we're going to jump in. God, I'm thankful for your church. I'm thankful that we can be here and celebrate who you are, the hope that you bring to our life. And God, I pray that as we learn this morning and talk about your word, God, that it will be real. Maybe for the first time, God, it will be real. Maybe for the first time this week. And God, I'm thankful that a room full of imperfect people, God, in desperate need of you, God, we can meet here now because of what Jesus did on the cross. And Father, that we can find freedom in life. Jesus, I pray this morning that we hear what you need us to hear, that we not be too prideful, too arrogant, too busy, too worried to hear what it is that you want us to hear. God, we're thankful for your love and your grace. It's your name we pray. Amen. I got up early and I got dressed and got ready for school as quick as possible. I made it to school and I went right towards the locker room because inside the locker room where the results were posted. Inside the locker room, I walked through the locker room and I turned a corner, and around that corner there was 3 offices. And hanging on the door outside of the third office was a sheet of paper. That was the sheet of paper that I had looked forward to for the past week. It was the sheet of paper that told us if we made the baseball team at school or not. I walked up to the paper expectant to find my name there, excited about the next season, expectant about the possibilities of the upcoming season. And I look, and it's in alphabetical order. And I start making my way down this list, A, B, and I get all the way down right in the middle of the S's. There was not my name. And I looked at this list, and I was like, no, something's got to be wrong. And there's guys around me, and they're high-fiving, patting each other on the back and everything. And I look on this list, because, these are guys that I grew up playing with. And so I knew, how they played, what they played, everything like that. I thought I fit in, where I was supposed to be. And I look at that list, and my name was not on that list. And immediately, I kind of took a step back. Guys in front of me, they're excited. I took a step back, and when I took a step back, I started thinking to myself, where was my tryout not good enough? I started thinking about what skill was it that wasn't good enough for what the coach was looking for. And I started asking myself questions and started to doubt myself. Maybe I didn't have the right type of talent. And maybe I wasn't in the right shape. And as these thoughts began to kind of flood my mind, they kind of overwhelmed me. I wasn't good enough this year. Maybe I didn't know enough. And there was a word that began to kind of overtake my thought process. And it was the word inadequate. I was inadequate for the team that year for whatever reason. Based on the coach's definition, I was inadequate of what I was supposed to be for that team. And so therefore, I didn't make the team. And that word just kind of sat inside of me all day long. I'd see guys at school be like, Stigger, did you make the team? No. And it would just rattle that word inside of me. Oh, I thought you would. Yeah, me too. And my favorite question was, why didn't you make it? I don't know. Ask the guy that picked the team. I don't have any idea. And those questions just kind of sat inside of me all day. I came home and, my parents, they were excited thinking, hopeful that I was going to make the team, and said, did you make it? No, I didn't make it. Did you ask the coach why? No, I really didn't want to talk to him today. And if I did, it wasn't to ask him why I didn't make it. But anyway, I said, no, I didn't. You see, maybe for some of us, actually all of us, it probably wasn't baseball. Maybe it was. But for all of us in the room, we've had that feeling of being inadequate at some point. Where we're not enough. Whatever the measuring stick is, we're not enough. We don't know enough. We're not smart enough. We don't measure up to whatever the measure is. And so therefore, we're left feeling inadequate. As a teenager, it's wondering if you're noticed. It's wondering if you're pretty enough. It's wondering if you have enough friends, if you drive the right car, if you have the right phone. You move into an adult and you begin to feel inadequate of maybe your income, the house that you live. Inadequate in my appearance. Do I keep up with the neighbors? Inadequate in my relationship with Jesus. I've done too much. I've said too much. I've doubted too many times, and so I'm not good enough. Have I accomplished what I'm supposed to in life? Am I the parent that I am supposed to be? And we're left with these questions that are based out of our inadequacy. Did I study enough? Do I know enough? Have I been forgiven enough? You see, all of these questions, they stem out of not feeling as though we're enough. And friends, I'm convinced that one of the best things that Satan can do for us, one of the best things that he can do to us, is sometimes not to get us tripped up in some big giant sin, but to convince us that we're not enough. Because if Satan can convince us that we're not enough, we sit still in fear. If Satan can convince us that we're not enough, it dominates our life, and we sit still and we wonder and we always doubt and we always question. And while we're sitting still, Satan is just smiling because we're not accomplishing the things that God designed us to accomplish. And so if Satan can get us to live a fear-filled, inadequate, convinced life, then we're going to miss out on all of the things that God designed us to be. And for some of us, we're there this morning. For some of us, we're sitting right here not feeling as though we're enough. We've not produced enough. We've not brought enough. We don't know enough. We're not pretty enough, so we think. And we desperately are tripped up day in and day out from accomplishing what it is that God wants us to do. This morning, we're going to meet a man that he felt the same way. We're going to meet a man in Mark chapter 7. If you brought a Bible this morning, you can look it up on your phone. It'll be on the screen. But Mark chapter 7, we meet a man who feels inadequate. He feels inadequate because of a health condition that he has. He has a health condition, and because of that, it keeps him more or less on the sidelines of society. And as he sits on the sidelines of society, he misses out on something so much more. And Jesus invites him in. Jesus steps into the equation, and he flips it upside down. Mark chapter 7, we're going to begin in verse 31. It says, Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up into heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. As Jesus, before we even get to the man Jesus, as Mark writes, he tells us, he kind of gives us this map of Jesus' journey. And he says he went here and here and here and ended up in this place called the Decapolis. Now, why is it important? Are we drawing a map of Jesus? Here's why it's important. Because so far, a lot of what Jesus has done has been in areas with Jewish people. Which is what the expectation is. Jesus would hang out with Jewish people. But by this travel route, Jesus goes up into a region, and ending at the Decapolis, and all of these people are known as Gentile people, which these are different than Jewish people. They were not part of the original plan, and this is mixing things up. And so what Jesus does, and the reason that this is important, is because as Jesus comes up and through this route and ends at the Decapolis, Jesus says to everybody in that area, this kingdom is for everyone. I, Jesus, am for everyone. Not just the religious people, not just the Jewish people, the Gentile people, everybody. You are invited in. And so Jesus establishes what he's about by where he goes. And he goes and he ends in this place called the Decapolis, which means the 10 cities. And this area of the Decapolis, it is not a polished and perfect area. It's the furthest thing from what Jewish people wanted to go to. And he ends up there. The last time Jesus was in the Decapolis was in Mark chapter 5 when he called the demons out of this man and threw him into a bunch of pigs and they all ran off a cliff. And then Jesus was kicked out because of the economy downturn that it was for 200 pigs to run off a cliff. They said, get out of here. Take a hike. Now Jesus comes back. And they saw what this demon-possessed man was a few chapters ago. And now they see the crowds flocking to Jesus. And as Jesus comes into the scene, the expectation is different than last time he was there. Last time it was fear, and this time it's power. As Jesus enters into this area and he begins to teach and he begins to speak, there is someone that is unable, whether it's self-desire or ability, to bring themselves to Jesus. This man who, based on society standards, is inadequate to function as a normal person. He's deaf, he's mute. They bring him to Jesus. They bring him to Jesus. They bring this man's inadequacies to Jesus. What are they? Deaf, mute, and for whatever reason, an inability to come to Jesus himself. 3 strikes. 3 inadequacies, 3 places where this man doesn't measure up to the social cultural standard of the time. And they bring him to Jesus in hopes that Jesus will bring something different to this man's life. Jesus takes this man and he takes him off to the side. Jesus is not interested in attention. He's not interested in crowd pleasing. He's got plenty of crowds up until this point. He brings them off to the side. And in kind of this weird exchange, he puts his hands in his ears and touches his tongue. And then he says, be opened. But before he can even utter those words, it says there's a deep sigh. Why is there a deep sigh? A lot of writers write that this deep sigh talks about this investment Jesus is making into this man. As he pours out his power into this man's life, he says, be opened. And at that, when Jesus utters those words, the man now begins to speak. He can now hear what's going on. And it said he speaks plainly. There's different times when you're reading about Jesus, or maybe different things, growing up, reading about whatever, that you wonder, I'm going to ask Jesus about this in heaven. This is one of those things. I wonder what the man said. Right? Like deaf, could hardly talk. That's what the word means for speak. Could hardly talk. He's deaf, which means he can't hear what people are saying. He can barely speak. And now, all of a sudden, he's just able to speak plainly. I wonder what it was. The man who was inadequate just a few minutes ago, I wonder what it was that he is now able to say, thank you. Who are you? What can I do for you? I wonder what those words were. The man now, when he brings these inadequate moments to Jesus, he is now healed. In the places in this man's life where society says you're not enough, you need to fix that in order to be enough, Jesus steps in and says, let me show you. Where is it in our life, friends? What is the area in our life right now that we desperately wish that Jesus would utter the words, be open? We're probably not going to raise our hands for this one, but where is it in your life right now where you feel completely inadequate? Where you don't feel like you measure up or you are enough? Where is it in life that Satan has you convinced that you're not enough? You see, and oftentimes our struggle with inadequacy comes from the comparison trap, right? We get caught up comparing ourselves to who's sitting next to us. We get caught up wondering if we measure up to the person that's our neighbor or our coworker. We get caught up in this comparison trap. We look at those around us and we see where we think we aren't good enough. And then our measuring stick for adequacy becomes the highlight reel of culture. And the problem is that's not who we were designed to be. We were not designed to be the person down the street. We were not designed to be our coworker. We were not designed to be, the mom at the other side of the room or the dad on the other side of the ball field. That's not who we were made to be. But for some reason, we convince ourselves, if I was more like them, then I would be who I'm supposed to be. The best thing Satan can do is convince you to become someone that you were never designed to be, and then invite you into this tireless rat race of never measuring up. We all feel like someplace in our life there's a hole, and in that hole we don't measure up. Maybe it would be like a strainer. Hey, we put something in this to let the water run off, right? Strain something out. You see, this is a bowl that has a whole bunch of holes in it. And for a lot of us, we're probably not going to admit it or raise our hands or anything like that, but for a lot of us, this is how we feel. We feel like we've got a whole bunch of holes. I'm not organized enough. I'm not the mom who's always on time. I'm not the dad who makes the most. I'm not the parent that's involved. I've done a whole bunch of things that I regret, and so I can't be forgiven. And we have a whole bunch of holes. And what happens is we expect God, can you do something in me? Will you pour into me? And so God says, yeah, sure. I'll bring something good. And then it just runs right through all of our holes of inadequacy, where we have convinced ourselves that we're not good enough. And so we come back and we say, God, can you do something else? Can you show me something else? Yeah. And we tell ourselves that we're not good enough. And so then what happens is all of these things that God wants to do in our life, we've convinced ourselves we're not capable of doing them. And so it just runs out. And we're left feeling empty and dry and depressed and anxious. Because we're spending so much time worrying about who maybe we think we're supposed to be, or the areas that we're not, that we have forgotten to be. We've forgotten to be. And for a lot of us, we live our lives in a strainer. We've become a strainer. Or we have all of these holes that we think we have, and we've told ourselves that we have. And we've convinced ourselves that we have. And so therefore everything just runs out. But God did not design us to be a strainer. He didn't design us to live with a whole bunch of holes in life that we somehow try to patch up and get by. You see, Jesus wants to pour into us. And when we begin to see that who I'm made to be is better than who I'm convinced that I should be, we begin to hold water. And God pours into us, and it begins to fill up. It begins to fill up until finally we get to the point that more and more is poured in, and we hold on to it, and God says, you're a bucket person. You're a bucket person. You're meant to hold on to the good things that I've created inside of you. You're meant to be the person that I made you to be. And at some point then it fills up, and we fill up until we begin to overflow. And it's then that people around us begin to see who God made us to be. People living in the abundance and the overflow of God's power. That's who this man becomes. I mean, think about it. If he walks away from this equation, if he walked into the room right now, we're like, hey, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? He's like, yeah, I mean, there was a long time where I was deaf. And there was a long time where I really couldn't talk. Yeah, but what about after Jesus healed you? Yeah, I mean, there was that, but I used to be mute and I used to be deaf. And it's like, yeah, but then there was a whole bunch more that I'm sure happened in your life after Jesus healed you. Yeah, there was some, but I was born. You're like, dude, do you not see the good? He brought you out of that. That's not who you are anymore. You're not the deaf guy. You're not the mute guy. That's not who you are. You came in contact with God's power and you became something totally new, adequate for anything you're walking into. You're living in the overflow of God's power. And for some of us, it would seem ridiculous if we heard that man say that, but that's how we live. Hey, you met Jesus when you were 14 years old. You gave your life to him. What has the adventure looked like since? Well, I was 13. I did these things. Hey, you met Jesus when you were 25. Tell us what it's been like since when I was in college. My goodness. No. Friends, we're not supposed to live in the holes. We're meant to live in the power of the abundance and the overflow of God. The word here, when it describes this man as can't hardly speak, the same word, you know when it's also used? Isaiah chapter 35. And Isaiah chapter 35, it's not used in a sense of weakness and inadequacy. Isaiah chapter 35, the prophet Isaiah writes to speak of God's power. He says this, then will the eyes of the blind be open, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the mute tongue will shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and the streams of the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, and thirsty grounds bubbling springs. Isaiah chapter 35 is speaking to God's power and abundance. So the same word that is describing this man's inadequacy is said to also be one of God's strengths. Our truth for this morning is this, friends. When we look at what Jesus does in this man, and when we look at what he can do in our life, our truth this morning is this. The moments when we feel like we are not enough, Jesus is more than enough. The moments when we feel like we are not enough, Jesus is more than enough. Well, Matt, that's kind of simple. Exactly. He is meant for us to live in his abundance, in his overflow. This past week, I went to Subway for dinner. I picked up stuff for our family, and everybody in our family wanted green tea to drink. Okay, and so I get the drink carrier. I've got 4 cups, and so I'm lining them out. I'm standing there, and so I'm getting ice in one. I set it down where the green tea's at, and I flip the tab. It fills up, and I'm getting ice in the next. Kind of assembly line style. I'm getting into a rhythm. I'm on the last. I fill the first 2 up. Got lids on those. They're in the drink carrier. I get the 3rd cup, put ice in it, set it down, flip the tab. It starts filling up. And I grab my 4th cup, put it up on the ice thing, and it just spins. It just runs. I'm like, come on, I just need some ice. And pretty soon this big chunk of ice jumps out into the little plastic drop down thing. The problem is it didn't drop all the way down. Okay, and so it just sits there in this plastic thing. I said, well, that's dumb. And so I kind of stick, my finger up there. I'm trying to knock this ice out. All right, and so finally this chunk of ice falls down. It wasn't as much ice as I wanted, so I press the thing back in again. Okay, it starts to spin for a minute, and it spins, and another big chunk of ice just flops out into this plastic part. I'm like, that's annoying. And so I stick my finger, and this one was a little bit more lodged, and so I'm sitting there trying to knock this ice out, and I hear something. I hear something that sounds a little bit like a waterfall. I'm like, what is going on? And so I knock this ice one more time, and the sound is getting louder. And I look down, and I realize that tab of green tea that I had flipped up, that cup is more than full now. And there's green tea that is now running over the cup. It's on the counter where the drink machine is. It's dripping off. The front of my shoes are covered. And there's a river of green tea now starting to move its way through Subway. I'm like, oh no. So I flip the tap back down real quick. And I look at the guy behind the cash register. His name's Eric. And I said, Eric, I got this cup a little bit too full. He's like, oh, okay. And he walks into the back or whatever. That's all he said at that moment. And so I don't know what to do. So I just keep doing what I'm doing. I fill my 4th cup up with green tea and I put it in the drink carrier. And I'm kind of trying to stand to kind of block this river of moving through the restaurant. I'm using my feet to try to, dam it up of sorts. And there was a lot of green tea. All right. And so he comes out and he looks, he goes, oh my. There might have been another word in there we're not going to say, but anyway. And he goes, oh my. And he realizes that the mop is not enough, so now he's got to go back and he's got to get the rag, and he has to cook, like and I look at him, I said, man, can I help you? And he was like, no. Like, he doesn't even know what to do at this point. There's so much green tea, by the drink machine. He doesn't even know what to do. He's like, no. I was like, are you sure? He's like, yeah. I think in the back of his mind, he's like, how did you do this, you moron? Like, those are some of the other things that he didn't ask those questions, and I just said, all right. And so I picked my drinks up, my sandwiches and chips up, and I turn around, there's a whole line full of people. It's like the walk of shame, all right? You're like, oh, good job, buddy. They're on their phones, like, pretend they didn't see what's going on. It's like, everyone, you clowns, just watch me do that, all right? I know what's going on. And so I left and I got back in and I told Emily what I did. And she's like, are you kidding me? I'm like, yeah, we're not going to talk about it anymore. You see, for a lot of us, friends, we live our lives focused on that jammed piece of ice. We live our lives focused on that one place in our life that's stuck. The one place in our life where we feel like we don't measure up, where we're not good enough, where someone has told us we're not good enough. And we live our lives focused on that. And meanwhile, because we're so fixated on the one thing in life that's stuck, we miss the abundance and the overflow of God that's pouring out right next to us. We fixate our eyes on our weaknesses instead of God's power. In the moments when we feel like we're not enough, Jesus is more than enough. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. It says, his divine power has given us what? Everything. Everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. His divine power, God's power, the abundance and the overflow of God, his power in us gives us everything. Yeah, well, Matt, you don't know what I've done. It gives us everything. And if his power gives us everything, you know what that means, friends? That we never walk into a situation inadequate. If God gives us everything we need for a godly life, he equips us, he sets us free, he moves us forward, he equips us with everything. Forgiveness, hope, forgiveness, direction, purpose. He gives us everything. This morning, you're not your biggest mistake. You're a child that is invited into the abundance of God's power. This morning, you're not who your parents said that you were. You're a child invited into the abundance of God's grace. This morning, you're not your title. You're a child that's invited into the abundance of God's grace. This morning, you're not your best talent. You're a child who is invited into the abundance of God's grace. This morning, you're not your biggest mistake in college. You're not your biggest absent moment as a parent. You're not your biggest financial faux pas. You're a child that is invited into the abundance of God's grace. In the moment when you feel like you are not enough, Jesus is more than enough. You see, the moment that this man stood in front of Jesus and recognized the power that he had is the moment that this man went from a strainer to a bucket. And he became enough. Because even when this man felt like he wasn't enough, Jesus was more than enough. Friends, in the moments when we don't feel like we are enough, when something has convinced us that we're not, when we don't feel like we're enough, Jesus, in his abundance